Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Worst Retcons in Star Trek. So in this video I will count down what I believe are the 10 worst retcons made in the Star Trek franchise. So I want to start with a rant warning because I imagine I'm going to get quite yelly and upset in this video, and I know some of my viewers really appreciate and like when I do that. However, if you think it's silly for someone to get so upset over just a damn TV show, then perhaps this is not the video for you. But if you're all here for that, then yes. Let me get into what I think are the worst retcons of Star Trek. Now, before I get into my top 10, let me define what a retcon is. A retcon is basically something has been established in the franchise, in lore, or in canon, as some people like to say, being disregarded for the sake of telling this new story. Now, let me make something clear. I don't think retcons are automatically a bad thing. There are many retcons done in Star Trek that are necessary. I talked about this a lot when I covered the original series, because some of the lore that it establishes is incompatible with the franchise that came after it, so it must be ignored. One of the prime examples for that is in Balance of Terror, when they established that there was a war hundreds of years ago between Starfleet and the Federation that establishes neutral zone. However, they said the war was fought with atomic weapons, and it was before they had view screen technology, which is ridiculous because we have view screen technology right now in the 21st century. And so future entries in the franchise couldn't really keep up with this lore, and plus lore had changed, like only using atomic weapons. None of that made sense. That needed to be retconned. And now there are also other retcons which maybe aren't necessary but actually improve the story, such as the Cardassians. When they were first introduced as a adversarial race in the Next Generation episode, The Wounded, they were shown to have very inferior technology, and they fired on the Enterprise, which with its shields down and did barely any damage, and this was a top-of-the-line warship. Now, I've heard some people trying to come up with in-canon excuses for why this is, and that just makes my brain hurt. Just acknowledge that's a retcon, that later they decided to make the Cardassians a more main adversary, therefore their technology that needed to equal that of Starfleet, and so in the future they were depicted of having ships that could take down Starfleet ships. Now, this is a retcon, and it hurts my brain if you say it's not one, but it's a good one, because the Cardassians became one of the best adversary villains in Star Trek, so it's a good thing that they retconned this rather than stay true to what was established. Now, another example of a retcon that is definitely a retcon, but it leads to good storytelling, is in Strange New Worlds, where they retconned it so that Spock and T'Pring had a relationship prior to their failed marriage attempt that we saw in Time Amok, and that we see that relationship throughout as they try to appreciate each other, which is definitely a retcon, because in Time Amok they made it very clear that T'Pring and Spock did not have a relationship before this episode, and that it was highly suggested they hadn't seen each other since they were children. And it was also very clear that Uhura and Nurse Chapel had no idea who T'Pring was, where they both had met her in Strange New Worlds. Now, again, acknowledge that it is a retcon. Don't try to say it's not. It is. But it's okay, because it's Strange New Worlds are telling a really interesting story. I love seeing Spock and T'Pring's relationship unfold, so it is an excusable retcon because it leads to greater storytelling. And also, if I were going to name the best retcon in the Star Trek franchise, I would say the episode Turnabout Intruder, which very clearly established that women could not be Starfleet captains, which is something I am so glad they retconned. They absolutely deserved to be retconned because that episode was incredibly sexist and a piece of shit episode, which deserves to be ignored in future canon, and it definitely was, because we saw in Star Trek Enterprise, Captain Ramirez, I believe her name was the second Starfleet captain, a woman, and we later saw in Star Trek Discovery that Georgiou was a famous woman captain. Both entries take place before Turnabout Intruder, and also we get more concurrent examples of women being captains at around the same time, which is great because, as I said, Turnabout Intruder should be ignored, so that is the best retcon. So I'm not saying all retcons are necessarily a bad thing, but for the rest of this video I will be talking about the worst examples of retcons, because here's the thing. I think retcons, as I said, can be necessary and can lead to better storytelling, and if that case, then they're excusable. However, sometimes, in my opinion, the writers are just lazy and too lazy to keep up with what has been established, and what they do, the retcons they make, actually don't make any sense or make the story worse. Now, this has a lot to do with arguments I've seen online about canon, because there are several opinions I saw where someone was ranting and raving about how people complain about canon and how they act like, you know, the history and lore of Star Trek is a history book that you cannot defy, and they call them gatekeepers of canon. And I'm sure maybe some people might watch this video and accuse me of being a gatekeeper of canon, but here's the thing. I mean, I just lined out how I'm okay with them violating canon as long as it leads to good storytelling, as long as it makes sense, as long as it corrects a mistake, such in the case of Turnabout Intruder. So I don't think that's true. But as for the arguments that people make that I don't give a fuck, you shouldn't give a fuck about canon. If you do, you're being pedantic because it's just a fictional TV show. Who cares? I'm of two minds on that argument, because on one hand, I can definitely see where this argument's coming from, because there's a lot of people complained about Lower Decks saying, oh my god, try to fit this into canon. It's like, get over yourselves, who cares? Like, I'm on board with that. Like, who cares about trying to fit Lower Decks into canon? Like, if it doesn't fit, I don't give a shit. And also, when Discovery first came out, a lot of people were trying to say, oh, well, why didn't they should have just made it a parallel universe like they did in Star Trek 2009? And because if you make it in the Prime universe, it makes no sense, because it doesn't make any sense for canon, because why do they have this superior technology? Why do they have holograms and all this? And in that mind, I'm also like, get over yourselves, who cares? So I can definitely see the argument of canon should not be looked at as an unbreakable lore, that if it leads to better storytelling. And plus, like, it's necessary. I can't believe there's people who expected Discovery to look exactly like 1960s Enterprise. Like, that's stupid. Obviously, you got to update it. Obviously, you got to make it more relevant for the 21st century in which we're living in. So people who complained about that, oh, they wouldn't have holograms. But actually, holograms, even though it's inconsistent with Star Trek canon, it's consistent with the 21st century real life, that by the time we get to the 23rd century, we would have holographic technology everywhere. So that stuff does not bother me the least bit. And I also get kind of, I think that kind of bickering about canon is ridiculous. So I'm on board with that. The argument that canon should not be, this unbreakable lore, and you should care more about storytelling than you do about what is and is not consistent. However, the other part of that side, which of course I'll get to in my top 10, which I can definitely see the same argument of, is Star Trek is an established franchise, especially in the later entries, the later you get, especially nowadays in modern times. It's a well-established franchise with a built-in fan base. So if you're going to write an episode or make a new show or create a story for Star Trek, you are already coming in with an advantage. You have established lore, so you don't have to do any world building. You have, in many cases, if you're doing an episode, you'll have established characters, so you don't have to like create characters up, and you have a built-in fan base. You don't, which is why franchises are so huge now. Why the movie studios and TV studios keep going to the franchises, because it's easier, because they got that fan base already there. They don't have to build a fan base. They don't have to earn the audience's trust. They already have it. So if you're making a new Star Trek entry, then you have all of those advantages. However, you have to deal with the drawback. The drawback to having all those advantages is that you have this lore that is established, so you have to remain consistent with it. And if you just shunt that and ignore it because it's inconvenient for you, then I'm sorry, you are a bad writer. That is bad writing. You are taking advantage of this established world, established lore, and established fan base, and ignoring the consequences of doing that. That is reckless. That is bad writing, and bad writing should definitely be called out for what it is. And so that is what this video is for. It's lazy writing, actually, to put it quite frankly. It's lazy. You want to be like, oh, the hell with what's been established. I want to do my bullshit. That is disrespectful, and it's lazy. And so, while the other examples I just previously gave for retcons, I don't think are lazy or reckless, because they lead to better things, or they make changes that need to be made. So it's okay to break canon in those examples, because it makes more sense for the story you're trying to tell. But if it doesn't really make sense, and it's not really necessary, then it's just lazy writing. You are a lazy, bad writer. So let me get into my top 10 worst retcons in Star Trek, and we will start with a list of honorable mentions that did not quite make my list, but I did want to mention. And we'll start with my first honorable mention is Starfleet's first ship was named Enterprise from the show Star Trek Enterprise. No, it wasn't. Like, this is more of a lazy thing. That they did it to rely on name recognition. Oh, people recognize the name Enterprise from the original series of Next Generation, so let's steal that for our show, which it had been established when, in I think Next Generation several times you had pictures of all the ships named Enterprise, and Scotty came on the holodeck and says, show me the first Enterprise. Did the holodeck show him the NX-01? No, it showed him the NCC-1701. No bloody A, no bloody B, no bloody C or D, because that was the first Enterprise, and it's been clearly established multiple times. Now, you might think, oh, you're just nitpicking, Mark. It's not that big of a deal, which my counter argument to that would be, it's actually not that big of a deal to fix this issue. All you got to do, call it a different name. Call the ship a different name. That's all you have to do. Call the show the, I don't know, the Inquisitor, or just make up a new name for the ship. That's not a hard fix. The reason why they didn't do it is because they were wanting to steal that name recognition, and it actually doesn't make any sense. It's actually lazy. Just call the ship a damn different name. It doesn't make any sense to call the ship the Enterprise. Anyway, let me get into my next honorable mention. Is that tiny Maquis ship held over 70 people from Star Trek Voyager. Now, in the pilot episode of Voyager Caretaker, we see this Maquis ship. We see our main Maquis characters, Chakotay, Torres, and Tuvok, who's the infiltrator, and Ayala, who would become a recurring background character, a recurring extra. And we see them on this tiny, tiny Maquis ship that's clearly been established to be practically the size of a shuttlecraft, or a runabout if you want to be more generous. It's a short-range craft. That's how these Maquis ships had always been established, and it's certainly how it was portrayed in this episode. Yet, as the show went on, there was more and more Maquis crew members kept turning up over and over again until by the time we got to the 7th season, they flat out mentioned that there was, maybe it wasn't 70, maybe it was 60, but there was around 60 or 70 people, Maquis crew members who came aboard Voyager. How the hell did they fit in that tiny little ship? That's so dumb. Where did all these crew members come from? Anyway, that's why it's just an honorable mention. Let me get to my final honorable mention, and this one's a bit of a bigger deal for me, and that is Dukat had an affair with Kira's mother. No, he didn't. This is from the Deep Space Nine episodes Wrongs, Darker, and Death and Night, which also appeared in my top 10 most reckless examples of time travel video. And so I always had a huge issue with this episode for those two reasons. The reckless use of time travel and the fact that Dukat had an affair with Kira's mother is dumb. Now, you could make the argument it's not actually, in the strictest sense, a retcon, because they never specifically said that Dukat never had an affair with Kira's mother. But should they have to? I don't think they should have to say that. It's ridiculous. It's such serendipity that these two characters who are involved with each other and, you know, butt heads with each other throughout the series, it just so happens that, you know, the villain happened to know the hero's mother and have an affair with her, you know, 30 years ago. And they just brought, and he never mentioned that, he just brought that up out of the blue randomly just so they could do this episode. That is, to me, the definition of lazy writing. It's ridiculous Dukat had an affair with Kira's mom. No, he did not. Alright, so now it's time to get into my top 10 worst retcons in all Star Trek, and start with my number 10. The Vulcans held humanity back. No, they didn't. From Star Trek Enterprise. Another way I could have phrased this is the Vulcans are a bunch of dickheads, a bunch of assholes to Starfleet back when Starfleet was trying to get started. Now, I think this is a retcon because the Vulcans have always been portrayed as nothing but friendly. I mean, granted, they're a bit snobbish and they can be condescending at times. Looking at you, Mr. Tuvok. But they've been seen mostly as nothing but a friend to humanity. And that's how they were portrayed in First Contact. As it was portrayed as a really good thing. They had the great music and like, ooh, look at the Vulcans are on Earth. Isn't that great? Because they're such friends to humanity. And yet, in Enterprise, they took that condescending level and cranked it up to 1,000, where they were nothing but condescending to these stupid human babies that didn't know what the fuck they were doing. And then, of course, it was made worse by the fact that oftentimes they would prove right because the crew of Enterprise were so fucking incompetent. But anyway, that's kind of another subject. Point is, this was dumb, making the Vulcans the adversaries, making them condescending assholes, and it was done primarily for lazy writing, because they needed an antagonist for the show, and so they chose the Vulcans because they're too lazy to come up with something better, even though it's completely inconsistent for their characters as a race. So it was bad writing. So, next, we'll get into my number 9 worst retcon in Star Trek, and that is Sisko's mother is a prophet. This was revealed in the later seasons of Deep Space Nine, starting in Season 7, the last season, I should say. No, she wasn't. So this is presupposing that Sisko had a mother he wasn't aware of, because that his real mother was actually his adopted mother, and his father had met a different woman before and given birth, and that woman disappeared because the woman's body was being possessed by a prophet, a wormhole alien who exists outside of time. She purposely caused the birth of Sisko because they knew that, because they exist outside linear time, that they knew one day he would be, their emissary. And I talked about this before. Ira Stephen Barrett, showrunner of DS9, in the later seasons, particularly this one, had a strange desire to turn Sisko into a god, and he even said so. So this was just part of that, to make it so Sisko was this god, basically, and powerful being, and that's how he ends up ending the show, believing to go off and be a god. Which, come on. You don't need... Isn't it enough that this is a decorated Starfleet captain who's like a war hero and bringing peace to Bashir? You don't need to make him a fucking god. And it's just a ridiculous retcon that he was a prophet all along, or the prophets had... That's not how earlier seasons established. In the very pilot episodes, very clear the prophets had no idea who he was. I mean, you can try to say, oh, they were just acting. Yeah, right. That's completely inconsistent for their characters. Since they exist outside of linear time, then they should already be aware of the fact that this is the emissary and they birthed him in the first place. So this is completely inconsistent with the pilot episode. But not only that, the whole way the prophets were portrayed in the last two seasons of Deep Space Nine were completely inconsistent with the spirit of how when they were created in the first two seasons. That's because Ira Stephen Bear wasn't there. It was Michael Piller, who frankly was a better writer and better showrunner. And Michael Piller clearly established that it was making a connection to how, a society that's, let's say, less advanced would interpret advanced aliens as gods. This is something that Arthur C. Clarke, famously quoted, saying about that any future technology would be seen as magic, and allotted to really advanced beings, to more primitive people, would be seen as gods. And that's how they portrayed, because the Bajorans were really in their infancy when they first learned of these, aliens that exist outside of time and space, and so they perceived them as gods, but they weren't really gods. But then later in Deep Space Nine, they really openly defied this premise by actually making them gods and making them care about Bajor and look after Bajor the way that gods would, which is completely inconsistent with how they've been established. And was not necessary because it's too ridiculous. Like, you don't need to make Sisko a god. You just don't. Anyway, let's get into my number 8 worst retcon in all of Star Trek. And that is Noonien Soong had a son who was a cybernetics expert and who looks exactly like him. This is from Star Trek Picard, Season 1. This is so dumb. This is the laziest of lazy writing. They want to put Brent Spiner back in the show, and other than having him as Data, and this character just materialized out of nowhere halfway through the season too. Like, he wasn't even hinted at. He was just there all of a sudden. It was like, oh, I'm Dr. Soong's son. I'm like, the fuck you are. Like, he never had a son. Why did he never mention his son throughout all the run of Next Generation? And also, and he happens to look exactly like him. That way Brent Spiner can play him. This is some of the laziest, dumbest writing. And this character was just so nonsensical. And he happens to also be a cybernetics expert who's working with Bruce Maddox. Why do you need him? Like, you don't need him. I really do. And it also feels like this character wasn't even thought of until they were writing the later episodes of Picard. So it's not only a retcon for Next Generation, it's a retcon for its own show. This character's so dumb. Really hope we never see him again. Yeah. Soon had a son. The hell he did. Anyway, next, we'll get to my number 7 worst retcon in Star Trek. And that is 7 of 9's parents studied the Borg. No, they fucking didn't. The Borg weren't around when 7 of 9 was not that young. Starfleet had never heard of them. That's been very clearly established. And please, 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 for the love of God, do not try to come up with some bullshit. I've really splits my head open, and it makes me sad. It makes me cry for humanity when people try to excuse this and be like, "Oh, well, you see, they changed the timeline of First Contact so that the Borg, they knew about the Borg because we saw them in Enterprise. So they changed the timeline so they knew about the Borg earlier, and so Q-Who never happened." No, that's not how it fucking works. That definitely is not the case. You are just trying to make excuses for clearly a terrible retcon made by bad writers who were too lazy to keep up with the very simple fact that the Borg hadn't been established until Q-Who. This is very clear. It was not undone by First Contact. First Contact and Enterprise did not change this. And even if it did, which it didn't, by the way, but even if it did, that show was written after this show. So you're retroactively making excuses for bad writing. Plain and simple. They wanted to make up the stupid storyline with Seven of Nine's parents so they could do some character building for her. It's lazy. It's come up with a better storyline. Come up with a better childhood backstory. Stop relying on lazy, fixes that are completely inconsistent, like blatantly inconsistent with the fucking franchise that you're taking advantage of by writing for. And not only that, this is also inconsistent with just one season prior to this episode airing, where they showed Seven of Nine's parents, and they were much older, and they were heavily implying that it was kind of a freak accident, that they were in the Delta Quadrant, and it had nothing to do with the Borg. But now all of a sudden it does. By the way, in that episode, the ship the Raven was destroyed, and yet in this episode, like right when Tuvok and 7-9 was there, because they had no time to retrieve anything from that ship. In this episode, they have a giant library of fucking data chips that took Neelix hours to sift through that was supposedly came from the Raven. The fuck it did. This is such lazy writing. Anyway, I told you I was going to get a bit yelly. Anyway, let me get into, and it's hard for me not to get yelly when talking about this episode. Speaking of, let me get into my number 6, which is also from the exact same episode. This one is such a terrible episode. Such bad writing. Number 6, 7 of 9 was sent to Voyager as a sleeper agent for the Borg Queen. The hell she was. The hell she was. So this piece of shit episode is trying to imply that the Borg Queen had purposely set up 7 of 9 on Voyager so that she could gather all this information. Sorry, it's making my head hurt. So she could gather all this information on humanity so she could use that to send a plague back to Earth to wipe out humanity. Which, by the way, she never did, and that was never really explained in this episode why she never did that. Guess she kind of forgot. So we're led to believe by this episode that 7 of 9 was purposely put on Voyager, which is such a load of shit. It is completely and utterly inconsistent with an episode that just aired 2 years. 2 years. I'm not talking about something from like 30 years ago or something that's been established 50 years ago. 2 years before this episode aired, it was very clearly established that the Borg took every advantage to take over Voyager. They wanted to destroy Voyager. They wanted to kill Voyager. They wanted to destroy humanity. 7 of 9 kept trying to break free. She kept trying to return to the collective. There was no way in hell that it was their intention for 7 of 9 to stay aboard as a crew member. That is the biggest load of crock I have ever heard. And the fact that, she was there to gather information to build this virus, which is, it's a topic I'll get into a little bit later, but if the Borg wanted to assimilate humanity as badly as this episode states that they do, they could have done it easily 1,000 times before. They don't have to come up with these elaborate James Bond villain nonsense, complex, dumb plans to create viruses. God. Anyway, let me get into number 5 on my list. Now I'm getting into really, really bad stuff that's making me angry. So let's get into number 5 on my list. Species 8472 was a peaceful race who thought Starfleet were the aggressors. No, they fucking weren't! This one makes me really sad because Species 8472 only appeared in 2 really good episodes. Well, 3 if you count the 2-parter as 2, but I count that as 1. So really 2 really great episodes. Scorpions Part 1 and 2 and Prey. Which used them really well. And these episodes, particularly the Scorpion, very clearly established Species 8472 as space Nazis, basically. They came from a different galaxy of fluidic space, and they considered our galaxy to be a lesser form of life, like the way we look at it, ants. So they simply wanted to annihilate all life in this galaxy and take it over. Basically space Nazis. And they made that extremely clear. Like, Kess was in telepathic contact with them and could read their thoughts. They sense their thoughts, and they even came up with a cool catchphrase, but they only used it in 1 episode, so I can't even remember what it was. But it was definitely intended to be like their version of resistance is futile. It was something like the weak will perish, I think what it was. That was supposed to describe their whole MO. And then we get this crappy episode in season 5 where Species 842 are dressing up like humans so they can save on their cheap CGI budget, and pretending to be Starfleets and preparing to infiltrate Starfleet because they think that Starfleet are the aggressors and that they made the alliance with the Borg that killed them and that they're the threat and that they want to kill them. No. That not only is that inconsistent with everything that came before, it makes it worse, which is the definition of a bad retcon. Because if you, as I said, there's examples of good retcons, there's examples of excusable retcons. If you do something good with it, they ruined Species 8472 with this episode. They never appeared after this episode because that race, who had a lot of potential, was completely ruined. This episode destroyed them, ruined them, made them these laughable jokes by completely changing their backstory. And also, like, they didn't believe Janeway that Voyager, that the humans weren't from the Delta Quadrant, even though they were able to recreate Earth, Starfleet, to a T, to every little detail, and yet they didn't even know they were from the Delta Quadrant, which is such bad writing. These writers don't care. This is what the writers of this episode is telling me. They are lazy as fuck. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about Star Trek. They don't care. Anyway, let me get into number 4 worst retcon in Star Trek, and that is time travel creates a parallel universe from the movie Star Trek 2009. And now this is probably the laziest example of writing. This is such a lazy example of writing. This is like the pinnacle of lazy writing here, because here's the thing. How is this a retcon, you might ask? It's a retcon because very clearly almost every episode of time travel, use of time travel in Star Trek up to this point, has clearly established what I would refer to as Type 2 time travel. It's kind of time travel where if you travel back in time and change something that alters the one singular timeline, and this timeline is now different. The future is now different. The future you came from is now gone because you changed the past. So you have to go back and fix this before you can restore the timeline. And once you do, you restore it. This has been clearly established in episodes like City on the Edge Forever, Yesterday's Enterprise, some of the pinnacles of time travel episodes, and pretty much every episode of Star Trek has used this. Now, some has tried to break with this and use Type 1 time travel, such as episodes like Captain's Holiday and Time's Arrow, but those are also inconsistent, although not as bad as this, which I'll get to why. So those are also out of order, because here's the rules of time travel. You can do whatever you want, make whatever rules up you want for time travel, as long as they're logical and they make sense. But stick with it. You can't go back and forth on what rules of time travel. And very clearly, the Star Trek franchise is very clearly established through epic episodes like Yesterday's Enterprise and City of On the Edge Forever, and many, many more, by the way. Those aren't the only examples, they're just the biggest. That the kind of time travel is the Type 2 time travel. The altered timeline is changed. Now, all of a sudden, in Star Trek 2009, they are now saying if you go back in time and change the timeline, it splinters off and creates another parallel universe, something I would refer to as Type 3 time travel, the other worlds theory of time travel, that it does, the timeline you came from still exists, but now you also created this other timeline that also exists, that is now altered and changed from the past you made. This is the only use of this in the Star Trek franchise, because, as I said, Star Trek, very, very classically Type 2 time travel. Very firmly Type 2 time travel. So to suddenly introduce this is inconsistent. Now, why it makes it so high on my list and why I think it's such a terrible retcon, because the reason why they all of a sudden changed this thing is so they could be fucking lazy and have their cake and eat it too. Because they, as I said, this is, when I talked about in the intro, this is probably the worst example of them trying to benefit off of a built-in fan base and establish characters and lore while ignoring everything that came before. I'm sorry, but that's cheating. You're cheating. You're trying to benefit from all of what came before while at the same time ignoring it and spitting in the face and saying it doesn't matter. That is contradictory. That doesn't make any sense. So, which is why, by the way, I hate the fucking whole concept of doing alternate timelines like this, and why I get furious when people say shows like Discovery or whatever should be alternate timelines. This never should have been done, and it definitely should never be done in the future, because it is the pinnacle of lazy writing. I don't care if fucking Discovery has holographic technology or breaks canon. Who gives a shit? Grow up. I'd much rather have that than this bullshit of, oh, let's reset the timeline. It is the definition of trying to have your cake and eat it too, and cheating and being fucking lazy, because you want to benefit off of these known characters, known universe, but you want to say, oh, we're creating our different new universe that has, so we can do whatever the fuck we want with it and not having to worry about canon or lore, any of that, but although we're still keeping the canon for Enterprise, because that's something worth keeping. And we're going to have Leonard Nimoy, because he traveled from that timeline, so he's now in our timeline, that version of Spock. But everything else, we're just going to do whatever the fuck we want. We're going to destroy Vulcan, we're going to, do all the bullshit, because it doesn't matter, because we have our new universe, which is not how time travel has been established in Star Trek at all. This is the laziest, I think, in all of fiction, this is the laziest written cash grab piece of shit movie ever seen. Fuck it. Anyway, sorry. Let me get into my number 3 worst example of worst retcon in Star Trek. And that is the Borg have an intergalactic hub. Getting back to Voyager and the way they treated the Borg. Yes, they did. Voyager ruined the Borg. No argument about that. And they did it through these retcons. Here's one from, everyone would know, my favorite episode of Voyager. That's, heavy sarcasm. Because I think it's very clearly the worst series finale of all time. And nearly ruined this entire show. That is Endgame. That terrible, terrible finale of Voyager, where they're all of a sudden trying to say that the Borg has always had this technology of this intergalactic hub where they can send, it's like a wormhole portal where they can send the ship anywhere into the galaxy. I got a question. I got a question for you. Here. I got a question. So, the Borg can instantly send as many ships as they like to anywhere in the galaxy. So, pray tell, why the hell have they not assimilated the whole galaxy by now? Especially Earth, as I said, shows like episodes like fucking Dark Frontiers established. Oh, we gotta assimilate Earth. Oh, we want to assimilate the humans. Why not send a whole fucking fleet through your fucking hub and instantly arrive at Earth? Why not? Why not do that? Why are you sending one ship going really, really fucking slow that takes forever to get to Earth, and then a couple of years later you do the same goddamn thing again? You send another ship really fucking slow that gets there, and then years later you supposedly conveniently put a drone on board the Starfleet ship in order to gather information of humans, to create this plague that's going to kill them off. While you had this fucking intergalactic hub where you could instantly send an entire fleet of Borg ships and conquer Earth immediately, yet you never fucking used it. Here's why: because the intergalactic hub is a retcon and never existed. It's bullshit. This is some of the laziest, dumbest writing ever. Okay. Yes, I did give you a yelly warning at this video, so you can't claim ignorance from that. Anyway, let me get into my number 2. This is really going to get my blood boiling. My number 2 worst retcon in the Star Trek franchise, and that is Tribbles were made by Starfleet. This is from the short trek. I can't even remember what the trouble with whatever that guy's name is. I think it was a short trek where they used Tribbles, and god damn it. So this short trek supposes that this Starfleet officer, who is a bit of a moron, created this as a way to provide a food source. So he genetically engineered Tribbles, who didn't exist before, in order to have an abundant food source, because they reproduce at extremely fast rates and they overran the ship. Now, first of all, I want to say the short trek sucked, which was really disappointing. It wasn't really funny at all. It's really disappointing because I had 2 comedic actors that I love. The dude from Archer does the voice of Archer, not Captain Archer, but from the cartoon show Archer, and Bob's Burger. I'd never seen Bob's Burger, but apparently he did the voice for that as well. He was a great actor. He's a funny comedian. I like him. And then had Rosa Salazar, I think her name is, who I love from the other animated show Undone. Amazing underrated show. Anyway, so I had these great actors, but the story was dumb. It wasn't funny. But here's the bigger point. This is why I'm here, retcons. This is saying that a Starfleet officer a dumb Starfleet officer, by the way, genetically engineered this race of Tribbles to be a food source. I mean, they're mostly fur. I don't see how practical that is for a food source, first of all. And second of all, like, they have replicators! Now, you might be like, oh, maybe they didn't have replicators in the 23rd century. That was later, Mark. Maybe, but they still had food synthesizers, like, even in Enterprise times. I don't think they're that worried about food sources. And why is... I know the argument about, oh, it's mostly fur could be like, well, the guy was an idiot. That's a stupid argument, because he was smart enough to genetically engineer this whole race. But here's the bigger issue I have. Because the trouble with Tribbles, mind you, not the best episode ever. It is an overrated episode. But it made a lot of sense, because the lore that is established is actually something based off of real life that happens a lot in real life, is that Tribbles were okay in their environment because they came from a world with a lot of predators that could easily pick them off and easily kill them. And so in nature, you have a lot of times species evolve to have things that counter predators, like, most of the time animals have like deer or whatever will have a very keen instinct and be able to run very fast to escape the predators and stuff like that, stuff to balance things out. And the explanation they came for the Tribbles actually made a ton of sense, that their balance to the predators was to be able to reproduce in abundance. And so that way they wouldn't become as extinct. However, all of the predators using them would be able to, or feeding off of them would be able to keep their numbers down so they don't get too overabundant and become a resource menace. And at the same time, it feeds all the predators and makes them survive. So that's how nature works. It's like in conjunction and everything. However, when you remove the Tribbles from that natural environment, they are no longer kept in check by those predators, and therefore they explode and become a environmental menace, which is what happens in real life all the time when animals are taken from one continent to another where they're not supposed to be, and they thrive and destroy the natural life there, because that life had not evolved to deal with these predators. Something I dealt with a lot living in New Zealand, and I knew a lot of people who were conservationists, because New Zealand had a lot of native birds that were endangered by invasive species like rats and stoats and rabbits and stuff that was not supposed to be, did not evolve on that island. So this made a lot of sense, and it was a really great way to establish what how these Tribbles work, and it was a good message about the dangers of importing wildlife to places they're not supposed to be, which makes a hell of a lot more sense than some fuckhead dumbass Starfleet genetically engineering them. That's dumb. Now, the reason why this one is so high on my list, number 2, is because this is I almost made this my number 1, to be fair, because this is the only example on my list where I flat out do not consider this canon. Flat out. I mean, I'm close. I'm almost there with Star Trek 2009, but I'm all the way there with this short trek. I don't care what anyone says. As far as I'm concerned, this does not exist in canon, because it is too fucking stupid to exist in canon, because it violates what was a very good established species. Now, if they ever do anything with the Tribbles again, if they reference this episode, I'm also not going to consider that canon. I don't care. As far as I'm concerned, I don't care what anyone says, any logic, anything. I'm never going to change my mind about this. As far as I'm concerned, for the rest of my life, this is not a part of the Star Trek canon. It does not exist. It's a piece of shit that's better forgotten, except for when it's spit on like I'm doing right now, because goddamn it's stupid and it's lazy writing. Anyway, let me get into my number 1 worst retcon in all of Star Trek. And this one, to be fair, doesn't make me quite as angry as some of the ones that I just covered, but I think it definitely deserves to be number 1 because it has the biggest lasting effects, and it was definitely clearly out of nowhere and just really bad writing. And that is Bashir was genetically enhanced from a very young age. So he's been a genetically enhanced super genius this whole time. The fuck he was. This is clearly the laziest retcon ever, because you had this character of Bashir, and instead of trying to make him a more interesting character and come up with more interesting character quirks, it's clearly the writers weren't sure what to do with him, and so they, instead of actually working hard or actually coming up with creative writing, actually doing character stories with him, they just decided to cheat by making this sci-fi thing and building it into this character and pretending it was there the whole time when clearly it was not. Now, Alexander Siddig, who played Bashir, complained about this. However, to be fair, his complaint was only about the fact that, not that they did it, but by the fact that they never told him about it until the very moment they were filming this episode. He's like, well, I wish you would give me some heads up. That way I could have been able to play him more that way. which the reason why they didn't give him heads up, because they didn't fucking think of it until that episode. Because this is clearly, very clearly and obviously just made up on the spot. And so for the rest of season 5 and then season 6 and 7 of Deep Space Nine, they, tried to integrate this and make it into his character. And sometimes it did become interesting storytelling, such as the case with the genetically engineered misfits that they introduced in season 6. But every time they went back to the storyline, I just hated it. I groaned, because this definitely was not the case. It's been clearly established in stuff like earlier seasons where Bashir was only second in his valedictorian, and he had this huge rivalry with the person who was first. Now, obviously, clearly, the bullshit excuse you can come up with after the fact is that, oh, well, he was just pretending to be second so not to show off that he was so smart, because he was trying to hide that he was genetically engineered. Except for the fact that he clearly in that episode held resentment towards the person and was jealous towards the person who got first, which he would not be if he knew that he purposely let them win so to hide his genetically enhancement. And that's only one example of some of the flaws of this, such as Bashir losing to O'Brien with darts. And again, you use the bullshit excuse, oh, he's losing on purpose because he knew he was trying to hide the fact he was genetically enhanced. The fuck he was. It is clearly bad writing that was thought up of after the fact, that has absolutely no respect for, and it's lazy. It's a lazy attempt at, instead of trying to naturally create a better character, let's just give him a sci-fi quirk and that will make him more interesting. Lazy. And because it inherently changed the main cast member for 2 seasons, that's automatic makes it the worst retcon in Star Trek. So that is it for my top 10 worst retcons in Star Trek. Thank you so much for watching this video. You can be sure to leave your comments below. I'm sure I'll get some really strong opinionated disagreements and agreements, and I welcome both as long as they're done in a civil manner. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy, please check out my channel as I cover many more Star Trek material, and also other shows like The House of the Dragon, Star Trek Lower Decks, and Lord of the Rings of Power. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.